Hi, nutrition students. Today we're going to look at Chapter 11, and Chapter 11 covers the nutrients involved with bone health. What I think is important here is to examine this word right away, nutrients. Very often we equate calcium with bone health, and we will look at calcium, but there are other nutrients that are involved as well. And something that is very interesting is that in some countries in which the calcium intake is lower, bone health is better. So it's not only about calcium. Make sure you read the information about bone structure and bone growth and remodeling as well. Interesting to note that peak bone mass is achieved by about age 30. And when we look at osteoporosis, we will highlight how important this is. Many people think that after you stop growing, your bones are finished, but that is not true at all. You can increase bone density, add more mineral to your bone up to age 30, and your bone changes throughout your life cycle. Bone composition is not only minerals as well. It's important to note that it is 35% connective tissue. So we will look at this again when we talk about osteoporosis, but bone health is an area where we often focus on women, and for good reason. They have lower bone mass and density than men. But I would remind you that older men late in life, also have problems with bone density. Age is a factor for both men and women. We see more risks with Caucasian and Asian individuals than others, and those with small bones tend to have lower bone mass. And finally, after menopause, when estrogen drops so dramatically, this has a negative effect on bone health as well. Many of the factors that impact our bone mass are lifestyle factors. So it's really important to remember, just like with other chronic conditions, just like with health in general, there's much that we can modify. So adequate nutrient intake is very important, maintaining a healthy body weight, as a woman, having regular cycles, making sure that with your physical activity that you include some muscle loading or strengthening activities as well. Being aware that smoking and excessive alcohol can have a negative effect on bones, and knowing the impact that various medications have as well, and certainly ultraviolet B exposure in its relationship to vitamin D is very important. Now let's start with calcium. Calcium is 40% of all the minerals in the body. 99% of the calcium in our body is used for bones and teeth. However, calcium also has an important role to play in our body fluids, in our bloodstream, and you can read some of those roles here as well. But what becomes very interesting is the relationship between bone calcium and blood calcium. Now, when we talk about calcium deficiency, there's a couple of different ways to examine this. If we're talking about low blood calcium levels, that is relatively rare and has more to do with hormonal abnormalities or kidney diseases or medications than diet. Okay, so this is very important. Blood calcium is kept in a very narrow range. Rarely do you see blood calcium drop, but if you do, this can impact the muscles for sure. Now, when we talk about poor dietary intake of calcium, that will not affect your blood calcium. It affects your bone calcium. The bone acts as the bank for the blood, so it contributes its calcium to the blood to keep it where it should be. You can see that here, and I'll just look below, and you can see that a low blood calcium has the effect of, at the kidney level, decreasing the loss of calcium, at the bone level, stimulating calcium release from bones, and at the intestinal level, increasing the absorption of calcium. So when you don't eat enough calcium, that impacts your bones, okay, especially when this happens over a long period of time. So these are the recommendations for calcium. The average American falls a little bit or more below. This is the first time I've seen roll of 300s, but that actually is a good way to kind of quickly add things up. 300 milligrams for all your food throughout the day, okay, if you're eating a relatively healthy diet, and then add 300 milligrams for each cup of milk or yogurt. So it's very possible to get enough calcium from your diet. However, there are also some individuals who don't, and I'm one of them because I do not drink a lot of milk, a little bit on my cereal, yogurt at lunch, plenty of vegetables, but I do fall short of my recommendations for calcium. We'll talk about supplements in a bit. So as with many minerals, bioavailability is important for calcium, not only how much is in food, but also how much your body absorbs from that food. You can see that the body's need influences calcium absorption. In fact, during pregnancy, calcium absorption increases dramatically due to need. You can see that hormones, which we just examined, affect calcium absorption. And one of those hormones is vitamin D. Foods with lactose, slow moving through the digestive tract, and an acidic environment in the stomach. So here again, you need acid in your stomach in order to absorb calcium. People that use protein pump inhibitors for something like GERD, although it may be necessary, they have to be aware of how this might impact their bone health. Now notice that calcium is inhibited by phytic acid, oxalates, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, zinc, tannins, vitamin D, quite a long list there. Included on that list is decreased vitamin D and stomach acid that occurs with aging. So food sources, the most plentiful in calcium are the dairy products for sure, fat-free milk being the most nutrient dense, but there are non-dairy sources. We in America base our plate on having milk, and certainly that is the recommended diet and the diet for many Americans, but there are also many Americans who do not drink milk. So if we're focusing on calcium, we need to understand that there are other food sources of calcium that are non-dairy. For instance, for a vegan or for someone who has a milk allergy, and they are listed there. Included in the list are the calcium fortified foods, which includes the plant milks. And your textbook does a nice job of putting those plant milks side by side so you can take a look at not only the calcium composition, but also other nutrients as well. So here you see how dairy products are one of the best sources for calcium. Fortified orange juice is quite high as well. And look at canned salmon, okay, and tofu. So there are also non-dairy sources of calcium. Canned salmon, it is the bones in the salmon. In the canned salmon, they're very soft and you end up eating them. That is what gives you the calcium. It is not true that fish of all types are good sources of calcium, just like it's not true that orange juice is a good source only if it's fortified. Also, take a look at some of the dairy fats. Things like sour cream and cream cheese are very low in calcium. They're more fat than anything else, so they are not equal to what you would get from the dairy foods. Okay, now it's important also to avoid too much calcium. Too much calcium could possibly precipitate calcium in some of the soft tissues and organs. So there would be an increased risk of kidney stones, as well as some other problems there, including soft tissue calcification. So the UL is 2,500 milligrams, and that's important to keep in mind. When you are thinking about a calcium supplement to help you meet your recommendations, you don't want to overshoot by much. You want to just fill in the gaps with calcium. So as far as supplementation, keep to small doses. It is healthier that way. It is more like the composition of food. Make sure you buy your supplement wisely, looking for the USP symbol or checking that out on consumerlab.com. And be careful, because some of the calcium supplements that sound like they might come from a more natural source have actually been found to be dangerous because of environmental contaminants. So you really want to be careful with calcium supplements and do your research. In addition, when we talk about calcium, there's two main forms found in calcium supplements: calcium carbonate and calcium citrate. And it is important to note that the calcium carbonate requires acid in order for it to be absorbed. So you need to take it with food or an acid food, and you need to make sure that you have enough acid in your stomach. If you're someone who is taking antacids, then it's probably better to go with calcium citrate. On to phosphorus, that certainly works with calcium to contribute to bone and teeth strength, as well as its other roles. You can see them here. Getting enough is fairly easy in our diet because quite a bit comes in with food additives. We'll look at the sources in just a minute, but you see some of them there. There are deficiencies that are possible in preterm infants and vegans and people with alcoholism or just following a very poor diet. So they are naturally abundant in many foods: milk, cheese, meat, bread, nuts, fish. You can see quite a list here. And also notice that 20 to 30% come from food additives. And here we see, again, very varied sources. And one of the concerns about phosphorus is that we might get too much, which would increase the risk of tissue calcification or can cause some problems with bone mineral density if there's an imbalance between phosphorus and calcium. One of the beverages or food and beverages that has always been a concern with phosphorus are soft drinks. Certainly not the only high phosphorus food, but excessive consumption of soft drinks could possibly contribute to this problem. Okay, on to vitamin D. So vitamin D is essential for our bone health as well because it increases the absorption of calcium. So without enough vitamin D, calcium will not be absorbed well. Vitamin D is an interesting vitamin because it's actually a hormone, and it's actually not essential if we think about sunlight and how sunlight begins production of vitamin D. You can read through the process, but this process and relying on sunlight for vitamin D involves quite a few different things. One is that we're out in the sunlight, and a lot of Americans aren't. We're inside most of the day. The other is that we're out in the sunlight in areas that get strong enough sunlight. And unfortunately, a good portion of the northern part of the country don't have that strong sunlight. We also rely on our liver and our kidneys to make the changes to the active hormone form. And we see certainly with the kidneys that people with kidney disease or older people make less. By the way, I forgot something about the skin. Older people make less on exposure to sunlight, as well as people with darker skin tones. They make less as well. So we can say vitamin D synthesis, we can rely on sun, but that really is inaccurate because so many things do get in the way. So here you have a list of those things. I think I touched upon a lot of them. I didn't mention clothing. People who cover most of their body with clothing also wouldn't make the vitamin D that would be required by the body. And vitamin D is required by the body, certainly for our bone health, but far more than our bone health. Vitamin D as a hormone impacts many different areas, and you can see them here. We're only now looking at all of the benefits of adequate vitamin D and the problems with inadequate. We have seen through many studies that those who live closer to the equator have a lower risk of certain autoimmune diseases, also have a lower risk of some cancers. We see that athletes that have higher levels of vitamin D seem to have stronger muscles. So not to get all carried away and act like this is a super vitamin, but it goes beyond only bone health, even though bone health is important. Now, for bone health, you can read through this in detail, but vitamin D regulates blood calcium. We mentioned how important it was that that calcium stayed within that healthy range. And we see how vitamin D is involved at all different levels here. When there's a deficiency of vitamin D in children, we see rickets. In adults, we call this osteomalacia. In children, we see soft bones that bend. In adults, we see thin bones, similar to what we see in osteoporosis. And those at risk would be people with darker skin, certainly inadequate vitamin D in the diet. I didn't yet mention breastfeeding, but because infants don't get much sun, nor should they, most doctors recommend against that. Mothers don't get much sun, the diet can be low, all sorts of things. Breast milk may not, probably does not have enough vitamin D, so breastfed infants need a supplement. The elderly, because of decreased sun exposure, decreased ability to start the process, decrease finishing the process by the kidney of activating vitamin D, all those things are important. And diet without fortified foods. What we're going to see is that there aren't a whole lot of foods that are high in vitamin D. Okay, so here's a chart form of the same thing. So you see here that living in the northern latitudes, covering with clothes. I didn't mention air pollution, but that gets in the way as well as sunscreen. So when you put on sunscreen, stand behind glass, or in a smoggy city, or just don't go outside, you have limited exposure. We talked about age and skin and dietary intake. We talked about breastfeeding, fat malabsorption again, because this is a fat soluble vitamin. What happens with obesity is that vitamin D is stored in the fat and the release is inefficient. So people who are obese tend to have lower levels of vitamin D. And you can see liver and kidney diseases because the activation, that process is impacted. So a whole lot can get in the way. And this is what makes it even tougher. There aren't a lot of foods that provide high levels. Fatty fish is one that does. And if you are a regular consumer of things like salmon and sardines, you may be meeting your needs. Fortified foods do as well, but fortified dairy foods don't have as much vitamin D as you might imagine. Mushrooms, as well, okay, it's the only vegetable that has a precursor of vitamin D. What this boils down to is more than 90% of US adults fall short of the recommendation for vitamin D. And some experts on vitamin D think the recommendation's too low. So this is a problem nutrient, a nutrient that we have to pay attention to. It is probably a nutrient that many of you will see in your 3-day analysis as low as well. And some of you will also see it's hard to get that vitamin D up to the recommended level. So what about supplements? Many people require supplements in order to meet their need, but you have to remember this is a fat-soluble vitamin. So if you go overboard with supplements, you could reach a toxicity level. You have to be taking a lot of supplements to go over the UL for vitamin D. It certainly does not come from food. And a standard supplement at 1,000 IUs perhaps is not going to put you over. You would never have a toxicity from the sun source because that process is regulated. All right, and on to magnesium. It provides rigidity to your bones. And it's also important for other functions, as you see here. Quite a few enzyme reactions depend on magnesium. And we know it lowers the risk of type 2 diabetes and makes our teeth stronger. This is a mineral that many people are paying more attention to these days. Deficiency can cause irregular heartbeat. It can affect vitamin D activity. It can disrupt hormones, and it can be caused by excessive losses from perspiration, vomiting, diarrhea, diuretics, or alcohol abuse. Here are the recommendations for magnesium, where most of us, and there it is, average US consumption is less than the RDA. Refining grains takes a bite out of the magnesium that was in the grains before refining. So there are some sources, and you see milk and meats and chocolate, vegetables as well. Interesting to note about magnesium is that toxicity, there is a UL for magnesium that's fairly low, but the UL refers only to non-food sources. So it refers only to medications, laxatives, and antacids. Okay, all right, and fluoride. Fluoride, we know, keeps our teeth strong and resistant to acid degradation by bacteria. So it prevents dental caries or cavities. Getting enough fluoride is fairly easy when our water is fluoridated, but there are also food sources of fluoride as well. Tea is very high in fluoride, and if you're a big tea drinker, you usually meet your needs without problem. Too much fluoride can cause mottling or a permanent stain to the teeth. And you see that in this picture here. And the advice for that is not to swallow toothpaste with fluoride. Here are some other micronutrients that function in bone health. And we've talked about most of these already in different areas. Vitamin K is involved with bone health. If you take a calcium supplement for your bones, you may have noticed that it provides vitamin K as well. So let's talk quickly about osteoporosis. What you're looking at on the left-hand side here is the thinning of bones that occurs with osteoporosis. And a lot of Americans, you can see that here, have either low bone mass, not quite osteoporosis, or osteoporosis. Let's look at a quick little video here.
Osteoporosis occurs when the body fails to form enough new bone or when too much old bone is reabsorbed by the body, or both. In normal, healthy bone, remodeling occurs when osteoclasts eat away at the bone tissue and osteoblasts come in and refill the holes with new bone. As part of this process, the body uses calcium and phosphate to produce strong bones during youth. If calcium intake is not sufficient, or if the body does not absorb enough calcium from the diet, bone production and bone tissues may suffer. The bones become less dense and more susceptible to breakage. In fact, in people with osteoporosis, bone fractures often occur with very little stress. Osteoporosis occurs gradually during aging and is more prevalent in women.
And we did talk about the reason that it's more prevalent in women. Okay, women tend to have lower peak bone mass, and also an increase in bone loss after menopause. So that takes a toll on the bone mass of women. I did want to mention that when they said fractures occur with relatively little stress, people take a hard step and they can fracture a hip. People cough and they can fracture a rib in severe osteoporosis. And when we talk about the elderly and broken hips, it's a very serious event. 20 to 30% of those who fracture a hip will die within 12 months. There's a lot that's involved with hip fractures, and you can see that here. They are often spend time in long-term care or rehabilitation, loss of mobility, loss of independence, etc. So it's a very serious diagnosis, and we want to make sure that we prevent this as much as possible. So screening does occur, but not as regularly as perhaps it should. When there is a risk for osteoporosis, screening occurs. When there is a fracture that isn't expected, screening occurs. And certainly if you perhaps are taking medications that take a toll on the bones, etc. There are different stages of osteoporosis, and you see them here. Note that type 2 osteoporosis, or not stages type 2 osteoporosis is both men and women in their later years. This slide highlights the importance of what you do up until age 30. So pay attention here because this is important. These are two women with very different peak bone mass. Perhaps woman A made sure she got enough sunlight and exercise and a healthy diet in all respects. If she didn't get enough sunlight, she made sure she got vitamin D that she needed. And individual B maybe didn't exercise and was a smoker and a drinker, and her diet was poor. So they ended up with very different peak bone masses. When the inevitable occurs after age 50 or so for women, we see that woman B goes into the risk area. Okay, she gets into the danger area where woman A does not. So it's very important to tend to your bones all through your life, for sure, but certainly up to age 30, trying to add to your peak bone mass. With osteoporosis, there's not only an increased risk of fractures, including the hip, there's also a loss of height. And it's one of the reasons why later in life, usually after menopause, you have your height taken when you visit your primary care provider again. And what they're looking for now is not growth, but is loss of height, which is caused by the crumbling of these vertebrae. All right, so we should end on a positive note, and that is on prevention. Certainly getting enough calcium is important. If you can't get enough from your diet, fill in the gap with a supplement. Make sure you research the supplement, however. Do your exercise, including weight-bearing exercise, walking, running, muscle strengthening exercise. Stop smoking. Moderate your alcohol intake. Make sure that you get enough vitamin D through sun and foods, and perhaps a supplement if needed, and avoid excessive protein and sodium. I will mention that protein's a little bit controversial, and sodium has only a minor effect. These are more of a concern when your calcium intake is low. We know that adequate protein is important for healthy bones, but excessive protein may have a slightly negative impact. Okay, thank you.